Hello, my name is Lisa Adeli, and I'm with the University of Arizona Center for Middle Eastern Studies. I'm going to talk to you today about World War I in the Middle East, or as I like to call this talk, World War I explains the Middle East, because if you want to understand what's going on in the Middle East today, you have to understand World War I. So, sorry, there we go. So World War I in the Middle East, and I love this picture. Actually, it's of an Ottoman Sufi military marching band. Did you know the Ottomans pretty much invented the marching band? So if any of you do that, now you know. Okay, so why is World War I so important in the Middle East? First of all, it's because of modern nationalism, which really didn't come about because of World War I, but was greatly influenced by World War I and increased. Also, if you look at the borders in the Middle East today, you'll find that they're pretty much the borders determined after World War I. And many of the conflicts today, both within the region and between the Middle East and the West, have their origins in World War I, as you're going to see. So if you've seen anything in the news about Syria and Iraq and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, Lebanon, yep, World War I is the origins of some of those conflicts. As I said, it set the stage. I love this little cartoon here, because you can see that the man riding the bicycle of Middle East peace is having a little bit of trouble with his wheels. One of the wheels being, of course, the Star of David, the symbol of Israel, and the other being the crescent, the symbol of the Islamic world. Before you can understand anything, you got to look at a map, okay? And you can see here that when World War I started, that area that's yellow and the area that's sort of a tan or beige color that looks like a boomerang, that is what the Ottoman Empire had shrunk to. It had been a lot bigger not too long before, just maybe 200 years before. All those colored areas had been part, but gradually they fell off. It lets you kind of see that the Ottoman Empire had been shrinking in size and in power, mostly because of the growth of the West. We'll see some little bit more about that map later. So this picture here shows the Ottoman government proclaiming their entry into World War I. And you may say, why would they do that? If they're an empire that is shrinking, as you saw on the map, why would they want to get into a war? Well, I think the answer is they didn't really want to get into the war. It was kind of thrust upon them because they were in a dangerous world and needed allies. Let me show you a few maps and then you'll see what I'm talking about. If you look at this map here, you'll see that when the Ottoman Empire joined the war, they joined on the side of the Central Powers. That's the red going up the middle. You see it's the center, hence the name Central Powers. So you can see that the Ottoman Empire, which is down in the bottom right, Turkey, and the Arab land sort of below it, that it included Bulgaria, it included Austria-Hungary and Germany. And you see that the allies were the green powers, right? Russia, which is right above the Ottoman Empire on north and northeast. You can see also France and Great Britain. Why would they join that side if they had to join the war? And why would they join the war anyway? Well, they both those questions are related. First of all, if you think about the phrase, my enemy's enemy is my friend, and think about who the Ottoman Empire's main enemy would be. And you could see just looking at the map, it's got to be Russia. Russia is their rival in a lot of ways. They want to control those little bodies of water between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean called the Turkish Straits. They also just were interested in, quote unquote, protecting the interests of Christians in the Ottoman Empire. They used that sort of as an excuse to bully them in a lot of ways. I mean, at least from the Ottoman perspective. So Russia is the big enemy. Well, if the Ottoman Empire had joined on the side of the Allies, then Great Britain and France, who needed Russia a lot more than they needed the Ottoman Empire, might give some of their territory away to Russia. So it seemed in their best interest, if they had to join in the war, they would join with Austria and Germany. And you're saying, but why would they join the losing side? Well, it's like a lot of things in your life. I mean, hindsight is 2020. When you look back, it's so obvious that you shouldn't have done what you did, right? But when you're in the middle of it, I mean, right then, Germany and Austria, it looked like they really could win the war. I mean, Russia is pretty big, but it's pretty weak. And so I guess if Turkey had to join the war, they would join on Germany's side. Not that they wanted to join on any side. They would have preferred to remain neutral. But Germany kind of twisted their arm. If you don't join, you won't have any allies. And think about it. I mean, you have to have friends, right? And especially in a dangerous world like it was in 1914 and today. So the Ottoman Empire was sort of forced to join in the war, and they chose to join on the side of the Central Powers. Well, the Ottoman troops are the first group to be affected. And the Ottoman troops, you have to understand that the soldiers fought a very long series of wars. If you looked at the previous map, bam, bam, you see that the Ottoman Empire had been fighting pretty much continuously from 1910. They were fighting in different revolts in the empire. They were fighting 2 Balkan wars up in the area that's today Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, that area. And then they went right into World War I. And after, they were going to fight for an additional 5 years because of the problems with the peace treaty and the Turkish War of Independence. What this means is that it affected a great number of young people. Imagine if for 13 years of your life, you're at war. I mean, the good years of your life, when you're supposed to be getting married and having kids and doing everything like that. It affected the Ottoman troops a lot, and it affected their families. At least 770,000 Ottoman troops were killed in battle during the war, and many others were wounded or became sick, and medical care wasn't very good back then. They didn't even have antibiotics. If you got an infection, you know, you'd lose a leg or an arm or your life. So the Ottomans, we talked about who their opponents were, but think about what it means, what kind of fighting they did. When the Ottomans fought against the Russians, they were fighting in mountains and over snow. Sometimes they were waist deep in the snow. If you look at that picture here of Ottoman troops on skis, I think that's pretty cool and not what you expect. The Ottomans also fought in the desert. They fought the British in Arabia, in Egypt, and areas like that. They also fought in trenches, and the Ottomans fought at a big battle called Gallipoli, which is, I don't know if I could show you on this map, but if you look at the map here, look at where the yellow part is that says Turkey. And you could see up to the very west of the map, you see those 2 bodies of water, again, the Turkish Straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. And it's in this area that they fought the Battle of Gallipoli against the British, the French, the British, the Australians, the New Zealand troops. They fought really well in these battles. The West believed the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe, but man, that sick man could fight. And a lot of people, died before the West really came to terms with the fact that this is a really serious enemy. The Ottomans also faced a lot of problems on the home front. Now, think about how different that is with the American experience, not only in World War I, but wars in general. In the American experience, we go to war, we send troops over to some other country, they fight there. There are some shortages in the United States, but basically we have everything we need because it's not our territory that's being torn up by the war. Then the war ends, treaty is signed, our troops go home. That's the end of it. Well, that's not the case with most people's experience with war, quite frankly. War brings tremendous problems in the territory in which it's fought. And the war was fought throughout the Ottoman Empire, and there were terrible consequences on the home front. Problem number one was famine. Well, why are people starving to death? Food is going to the troops, which means the family's starving. Also, there are troop movements. If troops are marching across your land, it's ripping up your crops. And at the time, you also had a plague of locusts. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. So there were less crops. There were enemy blockades, mostly the British, who were blockading ports along the Mediterranean, near what's today Lebanon, where a lot of grain shipments would come in. So there was less food coming in. Also, if people are away fighting wars, then there aren't as many men home farming the land. And whenever there's a battle, people flee the area, so there are less people farming that land too. Less crops are produced, meaning famine. And finally, there are forced population movements, genocide. And we'll talk a little bit later about what happens with the Armenians, but whole groups of people are uprooted from their homes and sent marching across the desert and starving to death along the way. The second major problem of the Ottoman home front was disease. And you have to understand that war and disease go together. They're partners, because soldiers don't march around with porta potties. So, the water gets contaminated and you get diseases that spread rapidly. Water and typhoid, and cholera, which are spread by contaminated water. Also, troops are living in close proximity to each other. They're not able to keep us clean. You get a lot of lice, and typhus becomes a real issue. Typhus killed off a huge percentage of the population of the Middle East and the Balkans during World War I. And of course, the troops would spread the lice from one place to another. And then at the end of the war, the last pandemic before the current one, there was a big influenza pandemic, which infected about 500 million people worldwide and killed 50 to 100 million of them. That had a much higher mortality rate than the current crisis. The influenza, again, wasn't caused by war, but troop movements spread it to different areas. Finally, and this it's not finally, this is Problems of the Ottoman Home Front, Part 3, a plague of locusts. And you could tell that this picture was not taken during World War I, it's in color. But it shows what a locust infestation looks like, and that's pretty dramatic. How would that affect the war effort? Well, it reduced the crops, which meant food shortages and starvation. And then you get starvation. Of course, you also get people less resistant to diseases and more likely to die from them. So it's a vicious cycle. At sometimes, troops this is mostly like in the Palestine area, Troops often had to stop fighting in order to gather up locusts because they became such a threat. Another problem of the Ottoman home front is unrest and persecutions. And there was unrest throughout. This picture is from Iraq. Persecution, the Armenian Genocide. The genocide is a persecution of an entire group of people. The Armenian Genocide in 1915 became the first real modern genocide. Genocides have occurred many times since then, are still occurring today. Why, you may ask, and what does it have to do with war? Because usually war and genocide go together. Think of the biggest genocide ever, and I mean that's the Holocaust, and that occurred in the context of World War II. And the reason for it is fear of the other population and nationalism. You know, as you get the growth of Ottoman and Turkish nationalism, Arab nationalism, you get a fear of other people making claims on that land. And those people were the Armenians, who were a Christian people, but they weren't really persecuted, I believe, because they were Christian. They're persecuted because they were Armenian and had claims to the land in the northeastern part of Turkey. Regardless of how afraid you are, though, genocide is never, ever justified. And in this particular one, between 1 and 1.5 million people were killed. Men were often killed outright, and the community leaders. Women and children were frequently rounded up, marched across Turkey and into the Syrian desert, where many died of exposure, disease, and starvation. A terrible black mark in history, and one, unfortunately, which would be repeated. In fact, Hitler even said before, when some people questioned his plans for the Holocaust, he said he could get away with it because, quote, who now remembers the Armenians? So kind of an important lesson, but never to do it and never to forget that it can happen so easily. So Allied policy during World War I was divide and conquer. In other words, if you go way back to that map, way back here, you could see the yellow part is Turkish, and the tan part is mostly Arab with some other peoples. We'll talk later about that. So if you could divide the Arabs from the Turks, then you could really weaken the Ottoman Empire. So the policy was to help support an Arab revolt, which was a nationalist revolt against the Ottomans. A lot of Arabs were beginning to think that in an age of nationalism, they didn't want to be ruled by Turkish speakers. So these ideas were going around. And this man, Lawrence Arabia, is just the most famous of the people. Not something we need to go into detail about right now. The Middle East also had serious foreign policy problems because of the war, mainly British and French interference. And I say British and French, and you're wondering, what about the Russians? Well, they were just, you know, fighting for survival. Remember, they dropped out of the war in 1917 because of the Russian Revolution. The United States, where were we? We weren't even in the war until later in 1917. So we didn't have anything to do with it, luckily. Not that we don't get blamed for it sometimes, but that's another story. So British and French policy was very inconsistent. And you can only see this if I spell it out for you. It's kind of ridiculous, actually. Part 1, 1915. Sir Henry McMahon, who you can tell is a British guy, is corresponding with Arab leaders. And in the correspondence, he seems to promise them, if you join in the war on the Allied side, join the Arab revolt, we will give you a large Arab state. Presumably that would include what's today Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Jordan. Okay, so the Arabs, when they went into the revolt, believed that they were fighting for an Arab state. And others, even who didn't join the revolt, but were thinking about it, were thinking that this was true. But the next year, 1916, was the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And you could tell from those names that Sykes was British, Picot is French. And they got together and made a secret agreement that after the war ended, the Middle East couldn't govern itself, even though they were the cradle of civilization and, you know, had been doing a good job of governing themselves off and on for 5,000 years. But they would divide up the Arab lands when they split the Ottoman Empire. They would divide the Arab lands up among themselves, Britain and France, what became known as the Mandate System. So to make matters more confusing, in 1917, because of some things happening within England, the Balfour Declaration was issued, which supported the principle of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Well, you can see that these are a little bit inconsistent. Palestine alone was promised to 3 different peoples. It was promised by Hussein McMahon agreement that it would become part of an Arab state. It was promised in the Sykes-Picot Agreement to be part of the British Mandate of Palestine, and it was promised to the Jews as a Jewish homeland, that at least part of it would go to them. You can understand why the Arabs and the Jews felt really betrayed at the end of the war, and we'll get there in a minute. Now, if you look at the end of the war, you can see that Middle Easterners weren't really invited to share their opinion of what would happen to their country. Mostly decisions were made by European old white men, by Britain, France, Italy, and the United States. To a lesser extent, we took a lesser role in this. So even Germany wasn't invited, and they were European. You can imagine that nobody else was invited too. So after the war, what happens is the Arab lands are split from Turkey, as you see here, and are put under the Mandate System. Syria and Lebanon became part of the French Mandate. Iraq, Transjordan, which became Jordan, and Palestine, which became Palestine and Israel, became part of the Palestine Mandate. And these borders, which had never existed before, now exist. We'll talk about why that's a problem in a minute. Saudi Arabia was separate, and because of the Arab revolt and all of that, and but they didn't become an independent country really until 1932, but they were well on their way. Now, why is this really disappointing for people in the Middle East? First of all, the Arabs are very dissatisfied. The borders were concerned without, the borders were drawn without consulting them. They wanted to be part of one big state. Instead, they're all split up. Different groups are even split up into different countries. Like, for example, Syria and Lebanon, which really share a whole lot of things in common, including trade zones. And now there are borders between them. You know, the Jordan, the Transjordan from the Palestine Mandate, when really they were the same basic population. Then other groups were lumped into one country, like Iraq. The borders were drawn without thinking that not all the people in that country were Arabs. There are a whole bunch of people called Kurds, which we'll talk about in a minute. And that even the Arabs that are in Iraq, some of them are Sunni Muslim, some of them are Shiite Muslim. They may not exactly get along. The Arabs were also dissatisfied because the form of government and rulers were determined by Europeans. People always say, well, why can't the Middle East have more democracy? Frequently, they were prevented from having democracy. It's easier to control people who aren't democratic. So that became a big issue. The Kurds were tremendously dissatisfied. They didn't even get a country. And to this day, they are the largest group of people in the world without their own country. And I can't even tell you how many Kurds there are. A lot of reasons make it hard to count, including the fact that a lot of countries don't want to count, and a lot of Kurds maybe don't want to even admit because they could be discriminated against. Also, some people are mixed. It's really hard to tell, but the numbers vary from 20-something thousand to 36,000, let's say. People without their own country. So where are the Kurds? Here are the Kurds. You can see that they form huge minorities in Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And some of the unrest, especially in Turkey and Iraq, have to do with the fact that the Kurds don't have their own state, and that they often face problems, discrimination within the different states in which they are. Kurds, by the way, are very different from from Arabs, in that they don't speak Arabic. They speak Kurdish, which is an Indo-European language more related to Persian as spoken in Iran than it is to Arabic. Western interference also caused ethnic conflict. I mentioned Iraq, the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shia. Why would you draw a border and stick them all in together unless they were in within a much bigger entity? In Lebanon, there's been an ongoing problem between Christians, Muslims, and Druze. They all speak the same language, unlike the Kurds and the Sunni and Shia Arabs in Iraq. They're all Arabic speakers, but the French during the Mandate period after World War I practiced a kind of divide and conquer idea, where they split the Christians against the Muslims. And so this has continued up to the present. Also, the border with Syria was drawn according to French interests, not according to the interests of people in the region. A third issue is Jews and Arabs and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Now, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, don't let people tell you, goes back thousands of years and that those people can never get along. That's a Western idea which is putting down both Israelis and Palestinians. Those people got along perfectly well in earlier times. It was just that with modern nationalism and people competing for the same land, it split apart. And you see how during World War I that was encouraged when the Balfour Declaration was issued. It became even worse under the mandates because Jews were having a really horrible time in Europe in the 1930s with Hitler's rise to power, and much worse from 1939 to 1945 when you have the full-blown Holocaust. I mean, you have it starting earlier than that. That's why I hesitate. It did start in 1933, but the death camps and everything that came along a little bit later, again, when there's a war, it's dangerous. So Jews obviously needed out. They weren't allowed to immigrate into the US, which is rather a scandalous chapter in our own history, where we kept out those people who needed a refuge. And so many of them tried to go to Palestine, even though at this point, the Arabs didn't want any more people coming into the country and claiming it for themselves, and the British were trying to keep them out. So it was a tragic situation, really. we've been talking more about the Arab lands, but what about Turkey? Turkey was separated from the Arab lands with the Treaty of Severus in 1920, which ended World War I in the Middle East, and, well, temporarily ended World War I in the Middle East. We'll get there. And ended the Ottoman Empire and divided Turkey from the Arab lands. So what the Allies decided to do is, because they were doing mandates everywhere else, they decided to partition Turkey and put it under different zones of occupation. Well, you can look at the map. The international zone, that sort of tan, light brown, I don't know what you call it, that came under control of an international control, because they wanted to control the Turkish Straits. There's a Greek zone, there's a French zone, there's an Italian zone, an Armenian zone. The Turks are like, this is not fair. This should be our country. This is our heartland. So now you get Turkish nationalism kicking in. The Turks then had to fight a war of independence from 1920 until 1923, when the Treaty of Lausanne was signed, the last treaty ending World War I. So if people tell you World War I ended in 1919 or 1920 even, maybe, but you could say in the Middle East it didn't really end until 1923. This treaty, and you can see, by the way, in the lower left-hand corner, a man named, directionally impaired here. The lower right-hand corner, a man named Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who became the leader of the Turkish War of Independence. People call him the Turkish George Washington because he led the War of Independence and was Turkey's first president. So after this revolt and the Treaty of Lausanne, Turkey became an independent country. And the modern country of Turkey is extremely different from the Ottoman Empire. It's not the Ottoman Empire, the sequel. It's something completely different, because it's a secular state, not a religious-oriented state. It's a state, a Turkish national state, not a multi-ethnic empire. It has an elected democratic government, not an empire under a sultan. Very different entity. Well, that is the end of the talk. I just wanted to say that I just want you to think about the fact that World War I has totally shaped the history of the Middle East. Think about all the, I hope that wasn't across here all the time. World War I has shaped the whole history of the Middle East. You can see that it has affected nationalism and the ideas that came out of it. It's affected the borders, which were drawn during and after, right after World War I. It caused tremendous suffering of the wartime population and a lot of resentments that still haven't gone away. I mean, the Turks and the Armenians still don't have good relations, even though they're neighbors. It affects the way the Middle East has seen the West, because even though the US wasn't involved in making most of these agreements, in a way we've inherited what the Europeans did in the area. We're part of the West, and we've inherited the legacy of having been known as somebody who messed up the region. Therefore, I think you can say that it's really important to understand World War I if you want to understand the Middle East. And if you have any questions and you want to email me, my email is adeli@arizona.edu. You have to spell out Arizona, no abbreviations. So goodbye, and that's it. If I could figure out how to stop this. Stop.